The Sunday my brother's wife called me stupid in Spanish. She was sitting 3 feet away from me at my mother's kitchen table, as helping herself to a second cup of coffee and not bothering to lower her voice. She and my brother were speaking quickly, the way people do when they've shared a private language long enough that they've stopped being careful about who's in the room. My mother was at the stove. I was looking at my phone, and Valentina leaned toward my brother and said, in the particular brisk Spanish she used when she wanted a conversation finished, that the February transfer had cleared, that everything was where it needed to be, and that I would never put it together because, as she put it, I only understood what someone said directly in front of me. Like a child, she added, and smiled at something my brother murmured back. I kept my eyes on my phone. I poured more orange juice. I asked my mother if she needed help with anything. That was 4 months ago. This is what happened after. My father built Clearbrook Cleaners over 31 years, starting with a single storefront on a street in a town that had exactly one other dry cleaner and enough foot traffic to support maybe 1.5. He was wrong about the foot traffic and right about everything else. By the time I was in high school, there were 3 locations, a contract with 2 local hotels, and a staff of 11 people who'd been with him long enough to know his coffee order and both his kids' names. He ran it the way he ran everything. Quietly, carefully, with a paper trail for every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out, because he'd grown up watching his own parents lose a business to a handshake deal that nobody could prove went wrong. My brother Reed took over day-to-day management when Dad got sick 4 years ago. He was the older one, the one who'd stayed local, the one who'd always been in and out of the shops growing up, learning the machinery and the scheduling and the vendor relationships the way I'd learned everything from textbooks and problem sets, and the particular brand of stubbornness it takes to pass the CPA exam twice before 30. When Dad passed 14 months ago, his will divided the business equally between Reed and me, 50% each, with a provision for a buyout if either of us wanted out, at a valuation to be agreed upon, or if we couldn't agree, arbitrated by an independent accountant. I didn't tell Reed what kind of accountant I was, not because I was hiding it exactly, but because the opportunity to explain it had never really arisen in a way that felt natural at a family dinner table. My father knew. My mentor at the firm knew. The colleagues I'd sat beside in deposition rooms and audit sessions and financial irregularity hearings knew. But my family had always understood my job in the broadest possible terms. Something with numbers, at a firm downtown, stable income. Whenever the conversation veered toward specifics, I tended to deflect, but out of the habit people develop when their professional life requires a 2-paragraph explanation, and the table doesn't have 2 paragraphs of patience for it. What I actually do is forensic accounting. I find money that people have moved to places they didn't want found. I've spent 6 years building cases for litigation support, fraud investigations, and estate disputes. I know what an inflated vendor invoice looks like. I know how to read a pattern of transfers that, one at a time, look like ordinary business expenses, but laid side by side, in order, tell a completely different story. It is, without exaggeration, the work I was built for. And it is, also without exaggeration, the last thing my brother ever thought to consider when he looked at his younger sister and decided she wouldn't put it together. He wasn't the only one who'd made that assumption. Valentina had made it from the day she married into this family. She was warm with me in the particular way that people are warm with someone they've already categorized. Always asking about my weekend, always complimenting whatever I brought to dinner, always speaking in the careful, friendly English she saved for people she considered outside the working parts of her life. We'd never had a real argument. We'd never had a real conversation. And somewhere in 7 years of holidays and Sunday brunches, she had apparently concluded that the category she'd placed me in was accurate. I also need to tell you that I learned Spanish over 6 years, working with Latin American corporate clients at the firm. It was required for the division I transferred into. Nobody in my family had ever seen me use it, because there'd never been occasion to. Reed had picked up conversational Spanish through Valentina's family. They used it between themselves at home, and he'd grown comfortable enough with it over the years that he code switched without thinking. Neither of them had any particular reason to wonder whether I could follow along, and I had no particular reason to tell them until that Sunday morning, sitting at my mother's kitchen table, when I became a very specific reason to have told them sooner. The Saturday after that Sunday, I logged into the business accounts for the first time. I had login access. I'd had it since the estate settled, because I was a co-owner, and the estate attorney had made sure both Reed and I were listed on every account. I'd never used it before, because Reed was managing operations, and I hadn't had a reason to look. It was not suspicious for me to log in. It was simply something I'd always had the right to do and had never done, and I did it that Saturday evening at my kitchen table, with a glass of water and a legal pad, and the specific, focused attention I give to a new case when I don't yet know exactly what I'm looking for. It took me 20 minutes to see the first thing that wasn't right. A vendor called Coastal Supply Partners had been appearing on the books since the previous March. Cleaning supplies, maintenance materials, chemical procurement. Reasonable enough on the surface. Dry cleaning operations go through a lot of supply-vendor relationships, and it wasn't unusual for a new vendor to come in after an ownership transition. What was unusual was the invoice frequency. Every 3 weeks, without variation, a charge between $2,800 and $2,400 posted from Coastal Supply Partners. No seasonal fluctuation, no variation based on order volume. Just a steady, metronomic withdrawal that had been running for 18 months. I noted the vendor name. I cross-referenced the amounts against the supply line from the year before Coastal Supply Partners appeared. The previous vendor had averaged $680 a month for comparable materials. I wrote that number down. Then I searched the state business registry for Coastal Supply Partners. It was registered to a woman with the same last name as Valentina. I closed the laptop, I went for a walk around the block, then I came back inside and kept working. The number, by the time I'd traced every Coastal Supply Partners payment from the first in March of the previous year through the most recent in February, was $31,400. Not rounded. Not estimated. $31,400, to the penny, paid out of Clearbrook Klenner's operating account in 42 separate transfers over 18 months, compared against market rate for the same supply categories. From the previous vendor, the overcharge came to roughly $22,000. The rest was volume that had simply been redirected, the same materials, marked up and billed through a family member's company rather than the old supplier. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting there with those numbers in front of me. It wasn't the anger I'd expected. It was something quieter and colder. The specific sensation of watching a fact arrive that you can't argue with and can't send back. I'd felt it in professional settings plenty of times. I hadn't expected to feel it about my father's business. I didn't call Reed that night. I didn't call anyone. There's a version of this story where I fire off a message that same evening and blow the whole thing open before I have the full picture, and that version doesn't end well for anyone. What I did instead was pull the full documentation on Coastal Supply Partners through my firm's vendor registry access. Owner name, registration date, registered address. The company had been filed with the state 6 weeks before the first invoice appeared on Clearbrook's books. Then I called the family's accountant, a man named Mr. Fairbanks, who had kept Clearbrook's books since before I could drive. He was methodical in the way that people become when they've been trusted with the same numbers for 20 years. When I reached him and asked to meet for coffee without mentioning the call to Reed, he agreed in a tone that told me he'd been hoping someone would eventually ask. He'd noticed the Coastal Supply Partners invoices in September. He'd flagged them internally, mentioned it once to Reed in a way he described, quietly, as not firmly enough, and then let Reed's explanation, that Valentina had found a better vendor through a family connection, sit where Reed had left it. He hadn't lied to anyone. He'd accepted a story that was easier to accept than to challenge from someone who was, after all, the operating partner. I told myself it was a good faith arrangement, he said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. I didn't look at the registration. I should have looked. I told him I understood. and I meant it. 20 years of working with a family doesn't get erased by one vendor relationship. But I told him I was going to need him to sign off on a documentation package before I sat down with Reed, and he agreed without hesitation. I think he'd been carrying the discomfort of it for 5 months, and was relieved to have someone finally ask the right question in the right order. Here's where I want to stop and ask you something, honestly. When I found that vendor registration on a Saturday night, when I saw the last name and understood what it meant, would you have called Reed right then? Driven over that same evening and laid everything out before you had the full picture. Before is exactly how much, exactly how long, or exactly who had signed off on what. Comment A, if that's what you would have done. No waiting, no documentation, just the confrontation that night while the anger was fresh. Comment B if you'd have done what I did. Closed the laptop, went for a walk, and came back to build the case before you said a single word. I'll tell you which one I chose before this is over. I chose B, and I want to explain why it was the only choice that actually gave my brother a fair chance to respond honestly. Because here is what I didn't know yet, on that Saturday. How much of this Reed understood. Whether he'd known from the beginning that his wife's cousin was being paid triple the market rate. Whether he'd signed off on the invoices believing they were legitimate, or whether he'd simply trusted Valentina's management of a vendor relationship and never examined the numbers beneath it. Those were not the same situation. They were not the same conversation. And if I walked in with accusations before I had the full picture, I'd hand him every reason to get defensive before I could establish what he actually knew. So I spent 3 more weeks on the documentation. I pulled every invoice. I obtained written market rate comparisons from 2 other supply vendors in the region. I cross-referenced the signing authorities on each transfer. Some were Reed's signature. Some had been processed by Valentina under the operational authorization Reed had extended when she started helping with vendor management 2 years ago. The payments Valentina had processed herself outnumbered Reed's by more than 2 to 1. When I finally sat down with Reed, it was at the desk in the back office of the Whitmore Avenue location. The same desk our father had worked at for 20 years. I brought a folder. I did not bring anger, because anger was going to make him close off before the numbers could land. I walked him through it the way I'd walk a client through a case. Date, vendor, amount, comparator. No editorializing. Just the sequence, until there was nothing left between us, except 31,442 transactions, and a vendor registration with his wife's cousin's name on it. He went through 3 phases in about 4 minutes. The first was confusion. He'd seen the coastal invoices, of course, had signed off on half of them. The second was defensive. Valentina had told him her cousin had competitive rates, that it was a good deal for the business. The third was the particular silence I recognized from professional settings. The kind that happens when someone's mind is running arithmetic on a situation they hadn't wanted to do math on. She told me her cousin was giving us a discount, he said finally. Compared to our previous vendor, I said, we were paying an average of $680 a month. Coastal Supply Partners billed us between $2,800 and $2,400 every 3 weeks. He looked at the comparison figures for a long moment without speaking. Reed, I waited until he looked up. Did you know? He said no. I believed him. Not because I'm naive. I've sat across from plenty of people who said no and meant yes. But because I'd spent 3 weeks learning the shape of this thing, and the shape of it was a wife who had managed a vendor relationship her husband trusted her to manage, and who had made decisions within that relationship that her husband had not been asked to examine at the line item level. He'd signed the checks. He hadn't run the comparisons. He'd been trusting a marriage the way people trust marriages. And Valentina had put her cousin's business inside that trust and grown it. There was one more thing I needed him to understand. It wasn't only about the money. It was about what had been said at my mother's kitchen table 4 months earlier. In a language everyone at that table had been assumed not to speak. I looked at him across the desk and said, in Spanish, exactly what his wife had said over Sunday morning coffee. That the February transfer had cleared, that it was all where it needed to be, and that I wouldn't figure it out because I only understood what some put directly in front of me, like a child. The expression on my brother's face, when he heard those words in my voice, in that language, was something I won't describe in detail because it belongs to him. What I'll say is that it did two things at once. It told him I had understood that conversation, and it told him I'd said nothing for 4 months. He processed both of those things simultaneously, and I watched the weight of them arrive together. "How long have you spoken Spanish?" he asked finally. 6 years, I said. I worked with Latin American clients for 3 years before I moved to the fraud division. It was a requirement for the role. He sat with that for a while, then he asked what I was going to do. I told him the truth, that it wasn't only my decision anymore, that Mr. Fairbanks knew, that the documentation was complete, that Dad's will had an arbitration clause I wasn't going to invoke unless I had to, but that the money needed to come back into the business account, verified, documented, signed off, and the Coastal Supply Partners contract needed to end immediately. And then, I told him the thing I meant more than any of the rest of it. That I hadn't brought this to him to end his marriage or burn his life down. I'd brought it to him because he deserved to know what had been happening inside his own business, in his own household, in a language he'd thought was private, before someone else found it who wouldn't have handled it the same way. He didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that the front-of-house noise drifted back to us through the office door. The hiss of the press machine, a customer at the counter, the low hum of a business his father had built and trusted both of them to maintain. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about the money. "I didn't know she thought of you that way," he said. "I didn't know either of you thought of each other that way." That landed harder than I expected, because the honest answer was that it hadn't been one-directional. I had spent 6 years keeping my professional life in a separate category from my family, never explaining what forensic accounting meant in practice, never letting them understand what I actually knew how to do. I'd accepted the version of myself that my family had built. The younger one, the one with the accounting job downtown, the one who showed up for holidays and didn't make waves. And I had not corrected it. Not because anyone had prevented me, simply because I'd decided, at some point I couldn't pinpoint, that the gap was easier to maintain than to close. Valentina had filled that gap with an assumption. It had cost $31,400 to prove the assumption wrong. The months that followed were not easy. Valentina and I didn't speak for 6 weeks. When we did, it was in front of Reed and a mediator, working through a repayment structure that Mr. Fairbanks designed and that everyone agreed to sign before anything moved forward. Valentina's cousin's company was removed from the vendor list. The overcharged amount was repaid to the business account in 4 installments over 5 months, coming from their personal savings and, as I later found out, a loan from Valentina's mother, who was told only that the business needed restructuring. I didn't comment on that. It wasn't my money to manage. Reed and Valentina went through something that fall that I'm not positioned to describe fully, because most of it happened between them behind closed doors. What I can say is that by December they were still married, working through it, carefully, visibly, but still there. At Thanksgiving, Valentina asked to speak with me alone. We stood in the hallway, away from the kitchen, and she told me without preamble that she had underestimated me, and that she was sorry for the specific way she had done it. For the conversation at that table, in the language she'd thought was safe, for the category she'd assigned me years before she had any real evidence for it. I told her I accepted the apology. And then I told her something I hadn't told anyone else yet, that I had spent 6 years letting the distance between my professional self and my family self grow, because it was easier than explaining what I did at a Sunday brunch, that her assumption had found a space I'd left open. Not intentionally, and not enough to excuse what she'd done with it, but a space I had left open nonetheless. She looked at me for a moment. "You're saying it was partly your fault." "I'm saying I contributed to the misunderstanding," I said. "What you did with it was your choice." She nodded the way people do when they've received something accurate they weren't expecting, and we went back into the kitchen. My brother and I talk more now. Not just at holidays, not just the logistics of co-ownership. He asked me last month to actually explain, what forensic accounting looks like on a daily basis, what I look for, how I find it, what the process is. I spent 40 minutes answering that question over the phone. At the end, he said he'd had no idea it worked that way. I told him I knew. Neither of us said the obvious thing, which was that I should have told him years ago. That he'd asked variations of that question at various dinners, and I'd always steered toward the simple answer because the real answer felt like too much to get into over someone's Sunday coffee. The real answer isn't complicated. It just takes longer than 30 seconds to tell. My father used to say that a business is just a set of promises arranged in a certain order. The promise to suppliers, the promise to customers, the promise to employees, the promise to family. When one of those promises gets quietly moved out of the arrangement without anyone acknowledging it, the whole structure eventually has to account for the gap. Not always in dramatic ways, sometimes just in the slow, accumulating weight of a number that doesn't add up no matter how many times you run it. He kept every receipt. He signed his name to every line. He showed me the ledgers when I was 12, not because he expected me to take over the business someday, but because he believed that people who understand where money goes are harder to mislead. I don't think he ever imagined the two of us would need that lesson applied to each other. But I think he'd have recognized the choice I made. The folder, the documentation, the patience, the confrontation that waited until the case was built. The business is still running, all 3 locations. Reed handles operations. I handle the monthly financial review the way Mr. Fairbanks, and I agreed it should be done going forward. Not as a check on Reed's honesty, but as the structural safeguard my father had always intended co-ownership to be. It works better this way. We both know it does. We just needed 42 invoices and 4 months of patience to understand why. Valentina called me last week about something unrelated. A question about a contract her sister needed reviewed. She asked if I'd have time to look at it. I said yes. She thanked me and hung up, and I sat with the phone for a moment after, thinking about trust and how it doesn't rebuild in a single Thanksgiving hallway conversation. It rebuilds in phone calls about contract reviews, in monthly ledger checks nobody has to ask for anymore. In the small ordinary moments of a family slowly choosing to actually know each other instead of assuming they already do. That's where we are. Not finished, not fully repaired, but honest in a way we weren't 14 months ago, when my father left us a business and the two of us assumed, separately and incorrectly, that we already knew everything about each other that mattered. We didn't. We're finding out now, and I think it's worth more than the version of things we'd been carrying before.